Welcome to Chapter 6 of AP Psychology Learning. So, learning in psychology is defined as a long lasting change in behavior resulting from experience. As you gain experience, you learn. So, a famous type of learning is classical conditioning, first proposed by Ivan Pavlov. So the idea in classical conditioning is that you will associate neutral stimuli with stimuli that produces reflexive involuntary responses. So in simpler terms, first you have your unconditioned stimulus, and this is something that would elicit a natural response. For example, food, you look at it and you will probably get hungry. And the natural response it elicits is called your unconditional response. And then we have something called the conditioned stimulus or conditioned response. This is a neutral stimulus, so something you wouldn't react to at first, for example, a sound. And then when it is combined with an unconditioned stimulus, you gain a conditioned response. So in the model of Pavlov, he used dogs, and so the dogs have the unconditioned stimulus of food, and then when they see food, they begin to salivate, which is their unconditioned response. And then they have their neutral stimulus, which is also their conditioned stimulus, which in this case is a whistle. At first, when you hear the whistle, before the conditioning, the dog does not react. During the conditioning, first he blows the whistle and then he brings the food, so the dog begins to salivate, which is still the unconditioned response. And after a while, the dog will associate the whistle blowing, which is a conditioned stimulus, with food. So when he hears the whistle, he begins to salivate, making the unconditioned response a conditioned response. So if you see it here, the unconditioned stimulus is food, then your unconditioned response is salivate. Originally, your conditioned stimulus is whistle. So it goes conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, and then it goes to unconditioned response. But after a while, you can skip the unconditioned stimulus altogether and just go straight to unconditioned response, which is the same thing as your conditioned response. And then some terms you will have to know. So acquisition is the acquiring of new behavior. So learning is acquiring a new skill, acquisition of a new skill. And then there's delayed conditioning, which is when the food is presented after the whistle, a while after the whistle. This is ineffective because the longer the time span, the less the dog will associate the food with the whistle. And then there's trace conditioning, which is the presentation of the conditioned stimulus followed by a short break, followed by the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. So in comparison to delayed conditioning, this is a long break in between, and this is a short break. So obviously trace conditioning is more effective. And then simultaneous conditioning is when the two are presented at the same time. And then you have backward conditioning, which is when you first present the unconditioned stimulus and then the conditioned stimulus. This is very ineffective because the dog is not really associating the whistle with the food. And another idea is the idea of aversive conditioning. So in the example of Pavlov's dogs, he is conditioning a response into them. He is making them salivate when they listen to the whistle. Aversive is trying to eliminate a response. Or, actually not eliminate. Aversive conditioning is when we condition someone or something to have a negative response. to be afraid of something, for example. And then another important idea is the idea of extinction versus spontaneous recovery. So extinction is when you lose a conditioned response, generally after a long period of time has elapsed. So if you haven't been blowing the whistle and then giving the food, after a while the dog may no longer associate the whistle with food. So the behavior will become extinct. And then sometimes you may undergo a spontaneous recovery, where the dog will suddenly remember the skill that has been taught to him. This is generally because psychologists can't account for all the factors in a research, so the dog might be associating the salvation with other factors that are not only the whistle, which can result in spontaneous recovery. And then there's generalization versus discrimination. Generalization is the idea of subjects grouping a bunch of objects together that are similar and reacting to all of them. For example, if you are conditioned to be afraid of a rabbit, you might generalize that and be afraid of all white, fluffy things. And then the opposite is discrimination, where if you are conditioned to be afraid of a rabbit, you will only be afraid of a rabbit. And then just following that, there's second order or higher order conditioning. If we look back here, it is the idea if you had another condition stimulus 2, where you associate it with condition stimulus 1, and then with conditioning you associate that with your unconditioned response. It's another layer of conditioning. Generally, as you get more and more stimulus, it is less and less effective. And now we look at the effects of biology on classical conditioning. So there's the idea that the biology of an animal or humans makes them more prepared to make certain connections. So it's easier to make some connections than others. In the realm of humans, this can be seen through the Garcia effect. Humans are very easily taste averse. As I stated previously, if your conditioned stimulus and your unconditioned stimulus have too far a gap between them, generally the conditioned response will not develop. However, in the case of people, even if they get a stomach ache hours after eating a certain type of food, for example sushi, even though hours have passed, the next time they eat sushi, they might not like it as much due to the bad experience. The Garcia effect pretty much states that humans are easily taste averse. An example of this is in chemotherapy, where patients always have a sense of nausea, which will result in taste aversion. And now we move on to the second type of conditioning, which is operant conditioning. This is learning based on associating consequences with one's behavior. So this is very simply described in the law of effects, which states that the consequences of a behavior are pleasant, the stimulus response will be strengthened, pretty much. You are more likely to repeat an action if you like to do it. Common sense. And a famous example in operant conditioning is Skinner's box. So in Skinner's box, there is a rat who is trained to press a lever. So he presses a lever, and if he presses a lever, he gets food. If he doesn't press a lever, he gets nothing, and sometimes if he doesn't press a lever, he might get shocked. Those are all different types of operant conditioning. So breaking that down to the simplest terms, there is reinforcement and reinforcer. So in the example of a rat pressing a lever and getting food, the food is considered the reinforcer, and then the action of giving the food is considered reinforcement. There are two types of learning. There's escape learning, where an animal learns by trying to avoid or end an unpleasant stimulus. And then there's avoidance learning, where they learn by trying to avoid an unpleasant stimulus. So it's all kind of in the names: escape, avoid. And then there's also chaining, where instead of only one activity, you have multiple actions. In the example of Skinner's box, perhaps a rat has to first press a button and then press a lever in that order in order to get the food. That's chaining. You're chaining multiple behaviors together. And then there's shaping, where you reward each step of an action to get a completed action. For example, if you're trying to train a rat to turn in a circle, you first give it food when it turns a quarter of a circle, and then give it more food when it turns at half. So you give it at each step of progress along the way. And then there is Premack's principle. This explains that generally whichever of two activities is preferred can be used to reinforce an activity that is not preferred. For example, if a person likes playing video games but not math, you can tell them that if they do their math homework, you will give them time to play their video games. And furthermore, a very important idea in operant conditioning and in learning in general is punishment versus reinforcement. And these two can be split into positive or negative. So there's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and then there is positive punishment and negative punishment. So the difference between punishment and reinforcement is that reinforcement is trying to teach a skill or give a behavior, while punishment is trying to take away a behavior or remove a habit. So positive reinforcement is when you would give a positive stimulus in order to encourage a type of behavior. And then negative reinforcement is when there is a removal of something unpleasant. For example, in the case of a rat, for positive reinforcement, it's the giving of food each time the action is completed. Negative reinforcement will be if the rat was continuously shocked until it pressed the lever. And then in the case of punishment, as I stated before, is to make a behavior less likely. So positive punishment, or simply referred to as punishment, is when you add an unpleasant stimulus. For example, if you don't want the rat to press the lever, each time it presses a lever, you shock it. Kind of like in this picture here. And then eventually it won't press the lever anymore. And then negative punishment is when you remove something pleasant. So if the rat were to press a button and you first just gave it a bunch of food, and then the second it presses a button and you don't want it to do that, you take the food away. And then another important idea is the idea of reinforcement schedules. So there's two types of reinforcement schedule. There's fixed, and then there's variable. And then there is ratio and interval. So ratio schedules are when you give a reinforcement or punishment, generally reinforcement, after each number of times an action has been performed. For example, every 3 times the rat presses a lever, you give it food. So, and then there's fixed and variable. So fixed is, in the example ratio, it's exactly every 3 times. Variable, as in the name, it varies, so it's on average every 3 times. So variable, you can give it if it's performed at once. If it's performed at 5 times, it'll generally average out to about the same. And then there is interval, where you give it in a specific amount of time. So every hour or so, you give the reward. So the fixed version of that would be reinforcement every hour. Doesn't have to necessarily be an hour, it could be 20 minutes, 10 minutes. The idea is that it's a set amount of time. And then variable, it's reinforce on average around every hour. So first you could give it 40 minutes and then wait and then give it 80 minutes later. So generally variable, it is more resistant to extinction. Because the problem with fixed schedules is if you're giving a reward every 3 times, the second you stop giving it, the rat is going to, or the subject is going to be very confused, and it is just going to stop performing the behavior. But in the case of variable, it is used to not getting a reward after a set amount of time. And then generally, between ratio and interval, ratio is more resistant to extinction because being given a reward after a certain amount of times of doing a behavior, there is a closer relationship between your reward and your behavior than there is giving it every hour. For example, people generally prefer to be paid per task than to be paid per hour. So in conclusion, a variable ratio schedule is your best one. And then we are presented to the idea of instinctive drift, which is a tendency for animals to forego rewards to pursue their typical patterns of behavior. So it's just natural behavior. And then there is cognitive learning, which is pretty much proposed by radical behaviorists, such as Skinner, who believe that learning is without thought. It occurs without thought. We just do it naturally. And then there are many models for learning. First, we have the contiguity model, which is a model that's associated with classical conditioning. It postulates that the more times two things are paired, the greater the learning that will take place. It is also always about the togetherness of your stimulus determines the strength of response. This is all about how you need to have a short time in between your stimulus. You must make them more together. And then there is a contingency model, which is also a model of classical conditioning and rests upon a cognitive view of classical conditioning. It is the presence of one event that reliably predicts the presence of another. And then we move on to types of learning. First, we have observational learning, which is proposed by Albert Bandura. It is mostly in children, and is the idea that we'll learn by seeing, where we model others' behavior, just copying pretty much. And then there's latent learning, which latent means hidden, and it is learning that becomes obvious only once a reinforcement is given for demonstrating it. So it's like a skill that you never knew you had. And then there's abstract learning. It is the understanding of concepts. For example, tree or same, rather than simply learning a behavior. You have to learn the idea rather than the action. And then finally, there is insight learning, which is where you have that aha moment and you suddenly know how to solve a problem. Okay, so that's it for chapter 6 of AP Psychology. Hope this has been helpful.